Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Survive This Crit. We're the podcast that combines our love with horror movies and tabletop RPGs to see if we can survive each horror movies through homebrew D&D actual play. And today we're taking a break from the D&D actual play to do a deep dive into the film for this series. As always, I'm your final girl, Kylie, and join us as we explore the making of Little Shop of Horrors. All right, let's kick it off with a summary. The summary of Little Shop of Horrors. Meek flower shop assistant Seymour, played by Rick Moranis, pines for co-worker Audrey, Ellen Green. During a total eclipse, he discovers an unusual plant that he names Audrey II, which feeds only on human flesh and blood. The growing plant attracts a great deal of business for the previous struggling store. After Seymour feeds Audrey's boyfriend, Orrin, played by Steve Martin, to the plant after Orrin's accidental death, he must come up with more bodies for the increasingly bloodthirsty plant. Ta-da! A brief introduction to this movie. The budget for this film was $25 million, which at the time this film came out in 1986, it was considered one of Warner Brothers' most expensive films at the time, largely due to the creation of Audrey II. But don't worry, we have a lot more on Audrey II later in the episode. The gross of the film was between 39 to 54 million. It was considered a modest success at best. However, when it came out on VHS, it became a cult classic. People could not get enough of this musical. The film was nominated for 2 Academy Awards, one for Best Visual Effects and one for Best Original Song, Mean Green Mother from Outer Space. It was beat by Aliens for visual effects and Take My Breath Away, the original song, from Top Gun in the 1987 Academy Awards. Fun fact, the Best Original Song nomination, Mean Green Mother from Outer Space, was the first song sung by a villain to be acknowledged in the Academy Awards, as well as, I believe, the first song with swearing in it to be nominated for an Academy Award. However, for the live performance, they did clean up the lyrics to make sure it was appropriate for cable audiences. It won a variety of other awards, including nominations and winning Saturn Awards, as well as others. I mean, it really was a cult classic as soon as it got noticed because there's a lot behind this story. But real quick, this film was released December 19th, 1986, and let's dive in a little bit into the origins of the film. Most of us know it was a Broadway musical. It still is on Broadway. But did you know it's also a movie from 1960? I do have more on that a little bit later in the episode. It is considered one of Hollywood's biggest jokes on itself. That's how iconic this movie is. This movie was produced and distributed by Warner Brothers Pictures, and a little bit of the cast and crew. The cast and crew are described to be as controlled chaos at its finest, and I feel like that sums up this movie. There's so much going on, but it's done in such a really controlled and almost elegant way for it being chaos. The director of the film was Frank Oz. He is most known for directing the Muppet films, and this was his directorial debut that was not a Muppets project. He actually was not the first choice for the list of directors. Apparently, many directors turned down the film because of the daunting task of creating one of the largest practical effects and practical puppets in history at that point. Initially, Frank Oz said no to the project, but then he had a light bulb moment in regards to creating the whimsical singers, the Great Chorus, to make the film more cinematic. While the Great Chorus is in the original musical, he had ideas to make the film stand out, to show that these singers are a part of this reality and also not. Like, if you notice when you're watching the film, they don't get rain on them. And they're dressed, when they're singing, way better than the people that are living and working on the street. The producer of this film was David Geffen, and there was some conflict between David Geffen and Frank Oz creatively, especially with the casting of like Bill Murray as Arthur, who he had a couple of lines as being the patient who was super into the pain of Dr. Oren. The core cast for this film was Rick Moranis. He was known at the time for his comedic role in Ghostbusters. He talks a little bit about working with Steve Martin, who was the most well-known actor at that point. And Steve Martin, Rick Moranis describes him as being like really controlled and really meticulous with his comedic timing. I thought what was interesting about Steve Martin's performance too is his scene with Bill Murray as Arthur. Bill Murray improv'd everything. He had a script, and then on the day they were like, yeah, just go with it, do what you want to do. And Steve Martin stayed on script, which I think makes the balance of comedy in that scene just so delicious that it couldn't even be written. It was half of it was improv. Rick Moranis really does describe working with Steve Martin as just an amazing experience because he was such a professional and such a comedic legend. I mean, he still is. And Steve Martin also comes from the theater world as well. So I think there's a lot of connections there throughout with some of these actors who were originally theater actors or have pursued theater in the future. Like Steve Martin wrote the musical, I think it's Bright Star. Another theater professional that was in this film was Ellen Greene. So originally, for the part of Audrey, Ellen Greene was the original voice of Audrey on Broadway and off Broadway. She, like, Audrey was her. And for making a film in Hollywood, oftentimes they want a big name to sell tickets for a leading role. I mean, that's like the tale as old as time. That still happens today. But Frank Oz really fought for Ellen Greene because David Geffen really wanted Cyndi Lauper initially and then offered it to Barbra Streisand. He offered this role to more household names in the hopes that there would be more tickets sold. But Frank Oz really fought for Ellen Greene, and he saw that she played not only the comedy of the role beautifully, but also the deep and intense tragedy and sadness, because as we'll go into later, this isn't necessarily a happy story. But after her chemistry test with Rick Moranis, she was locked into the role. One of the other very important characters of this film is the voice talent of Levi Stubbs. He voiced Audrey II. They wanted someone who wasn't a comic relief because on Broadway, the role previously had been played more as a comic relief, but someone who has a bit of danger in their voice and their tonality. And Levi Stubbs, he is the singer from the iconic Four Tops Motown band. He was the front man for them. And he delivered a killer performance for this role. And finally, the last team members of our cast was the Greek chorus. For those of you who don't know a lot about theater, the role of the Greek chorus is essentially to tell the audience what's going on in the story. This was especially helpful for like Greek plays where there is a lot of complicated themes happening and you maybe don't know how to feel about certain characters and what these characters are feeling. So the role of the Greek chorus is to tell audiences the plot, like their bird's eye view of the plot, as well as like the emotional impact that audiences should be feeling. So the Greek chorus, one interesting note about them is that they were trained to move like 1960s singers, and they really are the heartbeat of the film. They take the film through each beat musically. The composer for this film, I just have to mention him, Alan Menken. He was very early in his career, but he is also the composer of a variety of Disney musicals, including The Little Mermaid. But this was before The Little Mermaid. So he was really inspired by 1960s girl groups and Motown music, which I think really shines in this movie. I do think in a lot of ways there's a movie that's not quite like it. And I'm excited to talk more about that toward the end of the episode. As for our final cast and crew little note, the design team. Roy Walker was the main production designer. And when I was watching this movie originally, I was like, oh, it looks like the Warner Brothers lot. And I was so confident that I was right. I was way off. Roy Walker is a 1976 production designer, Academy Award winner for the film Barry Lyndon. And how they pulled off this grimy New York street look was they built stages in London. Took them 3 months to build stages in London to look like New York. And the stages were so big, like the buildings, the puddles, they made it look so city-like that the puddles had to have their own plumbing. Another interesting part was that they wanted it to look like New York grime. So Roy Walker, the head production designer, and Tessa Davies, they sourced clothing and props from New York and flew back to London with all of them. An interesting point is that trash cans were the hardest to acquire. The ones in London looked too clean for their set. So they bought new trash cans in New York and went door to door and traded them with local New Yorkers in exchange for their crappy trash cans. And then one last little design note that I thought was interesting. Originally, when they had the dentist office created, they had blood strewn over the walls. And test audiences absolutely hated it. So they had to go back to the drawing board, clean up the look. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Because if you hadn't seen this movie before, you're kind of burying the lead a little bit better by showing a normal dentist office versus like the most chaotic and disgusting dentist office, which is more what the character is actually like. So as I mentioned earlier, the origins of this film are particularly interesting. So let's dive into that. Originally, this is technically a remake times 2. The original film came out in 1960. It's one of the most iconic stories in Hollywood because it's a film that was made within 2 days. It was an accidental creation by Roger Corman, who was meeting with a producer who had finished filming something on these stages. And the producer was like, well, we don't have anything coming to these stages. And Roger Corman was like, bet. Let's see what I can do. Just keep it up for 2 days. I'll make something. So they used the existing set that was already there. And he met with writer Chuck Griffith, who he had previously made a horror comedy called Buckets of Blood with. And they brainstormed for a day and a half and came up with the concept of a man-eating plant. And with that, they took, I think, like a week and a half to 2 weeks to write the film. They paid the actors for a week, had them rehearse for 3 days, filmed for 2, and they made a movie in 2 days, which is impossible and unheard. But fun fact, this was Jack Nicholson's first movie. And I'm honestly kind of curious to watch the movie. I saw a couple clips from it. And a lot of people say, oh, it's a bad movie, but it's interesting that it was made in such a short period of time, and it was just kind of a challenge, a creative challenge for Roger Corman to take on. And it's a challenge that paid off because it led to a musical that became massively popular and then a movie that became massively popular. So, like a decade and a half later, Little Shop of Horrors, the musical, was made. So David Geffen was brought on to produce the musical. Fun fact, he is the producer of Cats, and then, of course, the producer of the film Little Shop of Horrors as well. He thought the 1960s movie was terrible, and he was like, putting this on stage, this is going to be terrible, but he took the challenge on anyways, and it turned out to be a success. Moving forward in the timeline to the creation of the 1986 film, when they originally pitched this film, they had planned on a $6 million film with Spielberg producing and Scorsese directing. Obviously, it didn't turn out that way. As I mentioned earlier, there were a lot of directors who turned this role down because the idea of creating such a large practical effects monster was unheard of at the time. So, Another point I wanted to talk about was the original ending. The original ending of this film ends with an apocalypse. Audrey begs to get eaten after being mortally wounded. This also happens in the musical. And then Seymour gets eaten. So the team spent almost a year creating a miniature New York that was to be destroyed by Audrey. And I will show you a clip from it. Okay. So, as you see, has a much darker ending. He's going to be eaten by the plant. And I think we can just admire the puppetry here. I have a little bit more on the creation of this plant toward the end, but just I can't help but to admire, like, this was all practical effects. This was all pre-CGI, and I'm devastated that it did not win an Academy Award for creating this massive, massive monster. They built a miniature New York for the monsters to essentially destroy. And the creation of the miniature New York and all the costs that came with filming this, like, 5-minute part of the movie was $5 million. Now, this is the ending that more aligns with the musical, the original film, apocalypse, chaos. Again, what kind of makes this a horror film. But when they showed it to test audiences, they absolutely hated it. Audiences hated the original ending. I believe it had a 13% rating because of how much they hated it. Personally, I kind of like the original ending. I don't know if it's my darker sense of humor, but I think it goes with the theme of the 80s. There was a lot of campy, dark horror and dark comedies that were coming out at the time. And I can say that with confidence because I grew up in a household where we watched a lot of 80s dark comedies growing up. Like Better Off Dead was one of the films that I grew up watching all the time. And that's a dark movie. It's funny, but it's also really dark. So I personally kind of like the original ending, but commercially, it just did not work with audiences. And so they scrapped that ending, refilmed the happy ending that audiences really wanted. As a side note, everyone was so jazzed by the creation of these Little Shop of Horror characters that in the 90s, 1991 specifically, there was an FX cartoon that made a Little Shop of Horrors show for kids. Essentially, it was a bloodthirsty monster that would teach kids lessons, which is kind of surprising because that's essentially the opposite point of what Audrey actually is. But they did keep the Greek chorus, and they were used in the form of cute little flowers, which I thought was really sweet. But FX attempted to make this children's show. However, the music was not well received. It was more just like plain Jane raps and stuff like that. That was just not as interesting to audiences. This show lasted a whopping 13 episodes and was not renewed because audiences didn't really care for it. More so, horror comedy did not jive with children's audiences when you change everything about what makes the dark comedy a dark comedy. So that was just a little side tangent. So, practical effects. The making of Audrey. So, the core creator of Audrey his name is Lyle Conway. He is known as the animatronics wizard. He was the lead designer and creator. He'd previously worked on The Muppets with our director, Frank Oz, so they had worked together previously. But before I show you a clip, I just want to give you some of the numbers that it took to make these monsters. There were 7 different sized Audreys that were made, 15,000 handmade leaves, 2,000 feet of vines, and 11.5 miles of cable. One interesting thing that they did is they worked with the Atomic Energy Institute to create vines that they had good control of and that could stay firm. Baby Audrey doing her best. Just the mechanics, they really did combine the best of mechanics and puppetry. And even in the small Audrey, you can see that it takes like 4 people to control it. And their goal with making Mini Audrey is that it could be like a merchandising opportunity, which shows because the original ending of the film, they have clippings of it, and that's how the plants take over. And everyone buys an Audrey II because everyone has to have one. And then, of course, they take over the world. So this is a little clip of the creation of Big Audrey with just the utter engineering marvel that went into making this is honestly kind of crazy. Let's see. At its biggest form, it took 50 to 60 people to operate the mechanics of Audrey II. As you can see, the cables are the vines are really well made, like they're stiff, they have control of them. And it's amazing just to think about how many different parts are moving. That's how you know there's like 50 to 60 people controlling this beast. And if you notice that it's singing really fast, that is intentional. Here's a behind the scenes look. Look at all those people working, pushing, pulling levers to make sure that this monster can move. It's absolutely insane, the engineering marvel that went into creating this creature. So if you noticed in one of those clips that the mouth is moving really fast on Audrey II, faster than like any human could probably have control of these levers without breaking them. So Levi Stubbs could sing the song at the original speed that it was intended to be. However, they had to make a filming hack work to make Audrey's lips line up with the speed. And how they did this was they filmed the plant scenes at half speed, so 16 frames per second. And the cast had to act in slow motion. And then the editor would speed everything back to normal, praying that it would match Levi Stubbs' vocals. I did read somewhere that it took like 20 to 30 takes every time anything was filmed with the plant. And honestly, that makes sense. I mean, it's a massive engineering marvel that took up to 60 people to control. That's utterly insane. And you have to remember, at the time, none of this was automatic. It's a puppet. Every single piece of it is being controlled by an individual. Every tentacle, the mouth, the eyes. I don't think it really has eyes, but you get my point. Like, it's an utter engineering marvel, and I am so pissed it did not win Best Visual Effects. So, for my final point, I'm going to dive a little bit into my thoughts and opinions of this film. First of all, I really liked this one. I don't know if I'm just picking films that I like that I've never seen before, and I'm 2 for 2 for films I've really enjoyed. But it's fun, it's campy. I've been listening to the soundtrack in preparation for recording this episode, the original 1986 movie soundtrack, for the last 2 or 3 weeks. Joshua's probably sick of hearing I'm a Mean Green Mother from Outer Space play over and over and over again. But I love that they managed to create some really strong themes in the film instead of what could have been a shallow 1980s horror comedy. Like Somewhere That's Green, I think I mentioned that earlier. The lyrics on the surface are comical, but if you actually think about them, they're really quite sad and tragic, just seeing this beautiful woman suffering from a life of poverty and domestic violence, just begging for a better life. And they do tackle themes like poverty, classism, and they tackle themes like domestic violence, all within a 95-minute horror comedy. And they also tackle things like morality, like what is the line that you're willing to cross for the person that you love. And as I mentioned earlier, I personally liked the director's cut. I get why we didn't have it, because audiences would not have appreciated it, and it probably would not be the cult classic that it is today. But I love that. I mean, who knows with this RPG how our players will do. But if a giant flesh-eating alien comes from space to people who are completely unprepared, there's a good possibility you're gonna die from it. I'm just saying. I also wanted to point out the connection between horror and musicals. I'm finding it interesting that those two audiences in modern times are tending to overlap more. I think I'm included in this statistic because my background is musical theater, but I think it's easier to process dark horror themes when it's in the form of a musical, like Sweeney Todd's Taste for Human Flesh. And there's a great overlap between musicals and like jukebox musicals. I think there's a couple theaters in Las Vegas specifically that have been doing a great job of this with the unauthorized musical of Screamed and The Craft. Fun fact, we did interview our good friend Joey Derby, who played Stu on Screamed, the unauthorized musical parody. If you want to hear his thoughts on horror and musicals, feel free to check the link below and listen to that interview. But horror and musicals, I think there's more to be explored with the overlap there. Like I saw recently in LA, like they're doing a play version of The Exorcist. Like where is this overlap coming from, and how can we explore it more? Because I think creating horror into musicals is a really fun way to combine two great genres and two great audiences to create interesting and diverse stories. And I'd love to see more horror musicals in the future. Well, that is all the time that we have today. I appreciate you joining us for our Little Shop of Horrors deep dive. Come back next week as our D.E.A.D agents prevail against Orrin the dentist and Audrey II. And let's see if they survive. And let me know below what you think of the combination of horror and musicals. Bye, everyone!